All right. Sounds like all of you saw our very cool slide. All right, this is behind me, and in this photo here, we have Anne and Adoniram Judson. They are our missionaries this week, and we are going to hear a story all about their lives all throughout the week. But today, we're going to start with learning all about Adoniram. We're going to hear about his life up until when he meets Anne. And we're going to start all the way at his birth. He was born in a town called Malden, Massachusetts. So he was born when our country was still very young, and people were living on the other side on what's called the East Coast, and that's where Massachusetts is. And he was a tiny town. His dad was a pastor there. And as a pastor, what was common for pastors and preachers at that time was that they were also farmers. One of the ways that they would support their family is to have animals and to grow vegetables and fruit for their own family's food. And so he would have grown up getting to be a part of these things. Now, when he was 3 years old, something very sweet happened in his life. He gained a sister. Her name was Abigail, and he was so excited when she was born. And he was also super excited about something else that happened when he was 3 years old. He learned to read when he was just 3. Now, the reason this is so important is because it starts to help us understand just how unique Adoniram Judson was. And when he sat on his dad's lap at 3 years old and read him a whole chapter of the Bible, his dad said, "Something's different about this kid. And I think God's going to use him to do something remarkable one day." Well, as he got older, his family moved to another town called Wenham, and it was smaller. It was about half the size of Malden, and his dad moved there to become a pastor of a different church. And he was 4 years old when they moved, and he loved it there. He made lots of friends, and in fact, one thing that he really liked to do is he liked to play preacher with his friends. And he would stand there, he'd gather all his friends around, and he'd pretend, just like his daddy, that he was a preacher. Now, as he got older, when he was 5 years old, he gained another sibling. This was his younger brother, Elnathan. So now there's Adoniram, there's Abigail, and there's Elnathan. And these are the Judson children. Now, as he gets to be 6 or 7, he starts to be set apart even more than the other kids his age. Because while they're all out playing, even though Adoniram loved to play, and he was a really athletic dude, he loved to read even more. And that made him different than his friends. And he would read everything. He wasn't just reading books that would make sense for him to read. He read all of his dad's books. The neighbors would bring him things to read. He just read everything he possibly could. Again, his dad is realizing something's different about Adoniram. And then when he was 8 and 9 years old, he started to do puzzles. But not the kind of puzzles we're thinking of with all the pieces that you put together. Think more of riddles, or like puzzles that you solve them, math puzzles, things like that. So that is what Adoniram was so good at. In fact, everyone in the town knew how good he was. There was not a single puzzle he could not solve. In fact, one time a grown-up in town came to him and said, "If you can solve this puzzle, I'll give you money." And so you know what he did? He solved the puzzle and he made some money. He was incredible. And when he was 9 years old, in the newspaper, there was something called an enigma, which was like a very hard to solve puzzle. And so he thought, I can do this. So he got to work working on it, and he was able to solve it. And so he wanted to write a letter to the newspaper to let them know he had solved it. But he was nervous about his dad finding out. So he tried to do it in secret. And he went down to the post office to mail it in. But you know what? His dad caught him. And his dad found out what he did. But instead of his dad being mad, his dad was amazed. Once again, his dad is thinking, there's something remarkable about my son, Adoniram. And so the next day, he comes to Adoniram and he says, "I bought you a present." And he gives him a book. And he says, "It's a puzzle book. And when you finish this puzzle book, I'll get you another, harder one." And so Adoniram gets all excited. He opens it. You know what it is? It was a math book. That's what it was. And so he wasn't as excited at first, but his dad said, "Hey, these are what the bigger boys are doing." And so Adoniram, he loved a challenge, and he loved to work hard, especially that kind of work. And so he started doing the puzzles, and he was having a great time. And as he got older, he had to move a couple more times. He moves to a place called Braintree, Massachusetts, but they're only there for a little bit. And then when he's 14, they move to Plymouth. Now, Plymouth, can you guys see the water? This is the first time that his family is living on the water. And it's a port town, so there's ships and all kinds of amazing things. And it's busy. It's the biggest town they've ever lived in. But Adoniram's dad, he doesn't want to be around all the busyness. And so he builds them a house on a little hill that was called Winston's Hill. And it can overlook everything. And you want to know what's really amazing about the house that he built there? It's still there today. People live in Adoniram Judson's old house. It was built in 1900, 126 years ago. And it's still there. Now, the outside of it doesn't look exactly the same. They've updated it, made it look more modern, but the structure of the house is exactly as it was when Adoniram lived there. Now, when they moved there, it was an exciting time. But unfortunately, Adoniram became very sick. In fact, he got so sick that he and his family all thought he was going to die. And even though the Lord spared his life, it took him over 1 year to fully recover from his sickness. And during that year, he had a lot of time to think. You know, because he was so brilliant and he knew it, he really wanted to be famous. He wanted to be rich. He wanted to have lots of success in life. But because he almost died, he thought, well, what does it even matter if I get rich and then I'm dead? I can't use that money anywhere. So he started to think about what his dad did as a pastor. And he thought, maybe that's what I should do. You know, be rich in the eyes of the Lord. But after all that thinking and considering, he thought, no, I still really want to be rich. And so he set his mind to keep working hard to be successful. So when he healed, he knew he had a lot of work to make up on from school. And so he spent time making up the whole year he had lost. And not just that, he worked so hard that he finished another year of school, so much so that he was ready to graduate at age 16 and go on to college. So his dad helped him find a college that he thought would be a good influence and a good place for him to go. And so he ends up going to Rhode Island College, which is now Brown University. And while he's there, he meets a friend named Jacob Eames. And they become best buds. And they hang out all the time. And they talk about their desires to both be successful, both make lots of money, both do something super important. But Jacob also tells him about something else. See, Jacob, he didn't come from a Christian home and he didn't have any Christian beliefs. He believed in something called deism, which says, there is a God, but he doesn't care about me. He doesn't have any interest in my life whatsoever. And the Bible, yeah, that's just another book, just like any other book you'd read. And Christianity, well, that's no different than anything else people might believe. And he convinces Adoniram that this is right. And so for the 3 years that Adoniram is at school, he becomes a deist. But he doesn't tell his parents because he knows how upset his dad will be and how upset his mom will be. So he graduates. He graduates at the top of his class, and he comes home at 19. And he ends up, as a young 19-year-old, opening a school and teaching for a whole year. And in his spare time, he writes 2 textbooks. He writes a book about grammar, and he writes a book about math. I mean, that's a lot of accomplishments. He did a lot as just a 19-year-old, but he was bored by it all. He didn't want to do that anymore. He didn't want to teach anymore. And so he told his parents he didn't want to teach. And they weren't happy. Teaching was a good job. And they said, well, what do you want to do instead? And he started to tell them that he had dreams to go to New York City, which New York was not known as being a very good and safe and, not a clean place to go. People made bad decisions with their life. They were very sinful. And that's what his parents knew, and they didn't want him to be any part of that. So during the discussion, Adoniram ends up telling his parents about his new beliefs. And his mother is devastated. She just cries and cries and cries. And his dad tries to sit down and reason with him and explain to him why Christianity can be trusted. And Adoniram says, no, I don't trust it. And so after 6 days of his mom just following him around, crying after him for 6 days, he says, it's too much. I can't take it anymore. So he packs up his things and he gets on a horse and he rides off to New York City. He has an uncle that lives on the way. So his plan is, I'm going to ride my horse until my uncle's, then I'm going to tie up my horse, and I'm going to walk the rest of the way. So that's what he does, and he ends up in New York City. But New York is not all that he thought it was going to be. He thought he could get there, make a lot of money, become super famous. None of that happens. He finds out that the only way that he can really make any money is to lie and cheat people out of their money. And even then, he's not really making a lot. He's poor. He's run out of money at this point. And after 1 month of having hardly any food and no real place to sleep, he decides, that's it, I'm out of there. So he goes back to his uncle's house, but he doesn't find his uncle there. He finds a young pastor. And they have a great conversation. It doesn't change Adoniram's mind about his beliefs, but it does give Adoniram something to think about. Because this young pastor, he had a lot of peace, and he knew where he was going in his life. And Adoniram didn't have any of those things. So he gets on his horse, and he keeps traveling back home. He rides all day thinking about this pastor and thinking about Jacob from school. He's starting to think, I bet Jacob has been successful by now. I bet he's doing something great. I bet he's making a lot of money. And he finally arrives after traveling all day at a little country inn. And he goes into the innkeeper and he says, do you have a room for me? And he says, yes. The only problem is you have to share it with a man who's dying. There's a curtain hung up so you can't see him, but that's the only space I have. And Adoniram says, that's fine, I'll take it. So all night he's woken up on and off by the sounds of this poor man struggling at the end of his life, right on the other side of the curtain. And so in the morning he goes down and he asks the innkeeper, how is the man doing? And the innkeeper says, he's not great. He died in the middle of the night. And as they keep talking, Adoniram finds out it wasn't just any man. It was Jacob Eames. His best friend from school had died right in that room, alone, without friends, without family. He hadn't made a success of himself. He hadn't made anything of himself. And so now the whole rest of the way home, Adoniram is so confused. What is he going to do? And so when he gets home, he talks to his parents, he meets these men, he has all these questions about the Bible, and these men invite him to come to a special school where he can learn all about the Bible and get all his questions answered. And so he goes, and after 2 months of studying, and researching the Bible, remember, he's very, very smart. He will not be tricked into something, will he? After 2 months of intense study, he realizes the Bible is true, God is who he says he is, and Christianity is real. And so he repents, and he puts his faith and his trust in Jesus Christ. And yay, his parents are so excited. And he goes back for a second year at the same school, and he realizes that what he really wants to do after getting saved is become a missionary. And not just any missionary. He wants to be a missionary that goes across the world to another part, across the ocean. And that wasn't really happening there. So he finds some friends. He finds some other boys that want to do this with him. They get permission to do it. And then he gets invited over to a deacon's house. And there's Adoniram gazing lovingly at Anne Hasseltine. The moment he sees her, he says, I know I'm in love. She was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. And so he spends the next month spending as much time with her as he possibly can. And then he asks her, would you consider marrying me? And she says, well, you kind of have to ask my parents first. And so he does. And you want to know how he asks? He writes a letter to her dad and basically says, would you be willing to give me your daughter in marriage so that I can take her to some really dangerous place where she'll probably die? That's how he asked. He wanted to be really upfront about what he wanted to do with his life. And so her dad says, I'm going to leave it up to her. And she said yes. And so she was ready to go. But in preparation for their trip, he had to first go to London, get on a boat and go to London. Now, after being on the seas for 15 days, something happens. Pirates! Arg! Yes, he meets French pirates, and they take over the boat that he's on, and they take him prisoner, and they take him all the way to France, and they're going to lock him up in jail. But God intervenes and sends an American soldier to help free him and to help get him safe passage out of France. He's able, after 4 months of being on the open seas, he's able to finally get to London, where he meets with a missionary board to ask for money. And God, through all of this, he provides the money that they're going to need to go on their trip, to get out of America and be missionaries. Now all they need is a boat that will take them where they want to go. And so finally, Anne and Adoniram and the others that are going to go with them, they hear about a boat going to Calcutta, India, which is pretty close to Burma where they want to end up. And so now it's time to get married. So Anne and Adoniram get married in a small ceremony. They have just a little bit of time to say goodbye to all of their friends. And then they sail off. And that is where our story ends, boys and girls. All right, guys. Go ahead and join your teachers and head out, and we can't wait to tell you the rest of their life.